I'm happy to be here tonight. My first time in Luxembourg. I trust you're being translated. And before we begin, I would also like to say a few words about Stefan Hessel, who was a friend of mine as well. Stefan was very approachable, very much down to earth and in some ways a very simple person. And I think that was one reason why he was effective. I mean, his life was very inspiring. I mean, what he lived through. And of course, he was involved with the writing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with René Cassin and others, Eleanor Roosevelt. So that was impressive. And many other things. I don't have to go over his life. But I think Stefan's talent was to cut through all the words and all the concepts, and we talk about justice and human rights and international law and all these big things that are all important. We have analyses and so on, and just to cut through and to say, we have to be indignant. We have to be angry. We have to be outraged at injustice. Just as simple as that. In other words, to remind us that all these structures we build and concepts and analyses really have a purpose, and that is to end injustice. So I think his work cut through a lot of the academic language we use, and really I think that's what the young people especially responded to. He went back to the very basic of basics, which is that we all have to be angry about injustice. And whatever form of injustice moves you or is relevant to you, that's fine. So he was able to inspire a lot of the Occupy movements, Occupy Wall Street, movements in Spain, in Mexico. There's some thought that he probably was one of the inspirations of the Arab Spring. And certainly, I think that call to the young people of saying, you should be indignant, you should be angry, and it's okay. You don't have to be intimidated by neoliberalism and everything you've been taught. You can be angry, you can have emotions, you can care. And you can change the system. I mean, that was one of his major messages, is that you can change the system. And you have to change the system, because if it doesn't respond to the needs of human beings, it's a bad system. In other words, his language was very simple, but in a way very sophisticated, because he knew the international law, and he knew the human rights, and he knew everything, but he was able to reduce it to a call to be indignant against injustice. So sometimes in our society where we live such complicated lives, we need someone with that clear, simple message to break through and inspire us. So we certainly dedicate this evening to the memory of Stefan. I'm the head of an Israeli peace and human rights organization. It's called the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. And we're an activist group. We resist the occupation. And especially we've taken as our focal point the issue of house demolitions. So one thing I'd like to do tonight, just to give you a sense, for those of you who haven't been there, of what the occupation is like. I want to walk you through a house demolition, to come and follow a family as their home is being demolished. And the house demolition issue allows us to be in solidarity with Palestinians. It allows us to resist with Palestinians. Israel has demolished 28,000 Palestinian homes in the occupied territory since 1967. So it's a major issue for Palestinians. But we're not only an activist and resistance group, we want to end the occupation. And we want to achieve, or help achieve, a just peace between Israelis and Palestinians. So we're concerned with where are we going in this conflict? What is the solution? How do we get out of this mess? And one of the problems we have today is that there isn't. We have this urgent conflict that really is a global conflict. It disrupts the entire international system. It impacts on the lives of all of us. You know, there's about 5 wars being fought in the Middle East, but it doesn't have today a solution. Partly because the international community, of which Luxembourg is a part, and Europe, refuses to put the pressures on Israel that are needed to really end the occupation. So we represent civil society, you know, the people, trying to push for a just peace. And we have to be the ones to come up with a solution. We have to be the ones to mobilize public opinion. We have to be the ones to push, because the governments will not do that. Governments are the last ones that will do the right thing, if at all. And that's something that we have to remember. And that is that governments manage conflicts. They don't resolve conflicts. Governments do not lead. We elect governments and we expect them to lead. They're leaders. They're called leaders. But they don't. They don't. They manage and they wait until there are pressures that they can't resist, and then they begin to do something. And the problem is that we're in a bad marriage, because governments will not do the right thing, period. They won't, unless they're pushed by the people. And the problem is that we don't have power. We're not elected. We don't have a mandate. We don't really represent any particular constituents. And we can't negotiate. We can't sign treaties. We need governments to do that. And the governments won't do that on their own. And so we have to always keep pushing them. And so one of the issues that we all have, and we all feel it, of course, is how do we do that? What is our strategy? And what is our goal? So that this is an open question. Where are we going in Israel-Palestine? Because we don't today have a clear idea, and I want to explain why. So I want to put the issue of house demolitions and what's happening on the ground within a wider political context, and kind of give us a big picture, and then within that, look at the occupation itself. And I trust everybody has earphones that don't understand my English, and I apologize. So we can begin. I'm an anthropologist by profession. So anthropologists like to begin from the ground and work our way up. We have maps, and we'd like to meet people, and our analysis is literally grounded. So if we could begin with this, and this is a map of the two-state solution. In some ways, there is a solution that's been agreed upon by almost everyone. The idea of a two-state solution, of course, is based on the idea that there are two peoples living in Palestine, Israel, Israelis and Palestinians. Whether there should be, whether Zionism is colonialism, whether there should be an Israel or shouldn't, we'll leave that aside, because there is. And there are two peoples living in that country. And so the idea of the two-state solution, which is the internationally accepted solution, says, okay, there should be a Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel. Makes sense, on paper at least, because this is really one country, from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. The Palestinians call it Palestine. The Israelis, the Jews call it the land of Israel. Christians call it the Holy Land. Whatever you call it, it's one country. And all these internal divisions are new and don't mean anything. Now, in this one country today, half the population is Palestinian. Half the population is Palestinian. Now, there are about 4.5 to 5 million refugees from 1948 that live around Palestine, in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. So if even some of those refugees return home, and they have the right to return, there will be a Palestinian majority in the country. And yet, the two-state solution gives Israel 78% of historic Palestine, and the Palestinians, who will be the majority population, only get 22% of the country, the West Bank of the Jordan River, East Jerusalem, although Israel has already taken that from the Palestinians. Israel has annexed East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And that, of course, in these two pieces. So it really isn't a fair and just solution, where a minority gets 78% of the country and the majority gets 22%. But the Palestinians accepted this. Whether they should have accepted it or not is another question. But in 1988, before the Oslo peace process, 25 years ago, the PLO in Algiers formally and publicly accepted the two-state solution and said, we recognize the state of Israel and we want a Palestinian state in the territories occupied in 1967. So the Palestinians accepted really an unjust solution, but they took it. And then that became the basis, in a way, of the Oslo Accords, except there's one thing we have to remember. In order to begin the Oslo peace process, Yitzhak Rabin, who was the prime minister, compelled Arafat to write a letter, a public letter, saying that he not only recognizes the state of Israel, but that the state of Israel is legitimate. And Arafat wrote that letter, and on the basis the Oslo peace process began. But what's important to remember is that Israel never responded. In other words, Israel never, ever, until this day, recognized the existence of the Palestinian people. We don't use the word Palestinians in Israel. We talk about Arabs in a very general way. Israel never recognized the existence of a Palestinian people and certainly never recognized their collective right to self-determination. So in a way, Israel never accepted the two-state solution. And when Rabin was asked, well, wait a minute, how can you be in negotiations over what are you negotiating? Rabin would say, I don't accept the two-state solution because it would prejudice the outcome of negotiations. Maybe that will happen, but I don't want to commit myself before negotiations. So that's why Oslo failed, because it had no end game. There was no negotiations towards anything. But the point is, until today, Israel has not recognized the existence or the rights of the Palestinians. So that happened. The Palestinians recognized Israel. They accepted the two-state solution. That decision was ratified by the Arab League unanimously in 2002 in what's called the Arab Peace Initiative, in which the entire Arab world said, we will not only recognize Israel and make peace with Israel, we will integrate Israel into the region if it gives up the occupation. And Israel said no. And then, in about a year or so later, the entire League of Islamic countries, 53 Islamic countries, also made the same offer. And the two-state solution, of course, is accepted by Europe. It's accepted even by the United States. This is the solution of the international community. So you say, well, wait a minute. The international community agrees. The Palestinians agree. The Muslim world agrees. So why don't tomorrow morning we sit down and end this conflict? Because there's one party that doesn't agree, and that's Israel. Israel says no. And in fact, the Israeli policy, as we'll see, is towards claiming the entire country. Israel has denied always that there is an occupation. Israel says there is no occupation because there is no people that had sovereign claim over the land. So there's no occupation, there's no Palestinians, there's no West Bank, it's Judea and Samaria, and therefore there are no settlements or colonies, and therefore we're in a process of reclaiming our historic homeland. And the Palestinians don't matter. They can leave, they can stay as Arabs, not as Palestinians, but this is where we're going. Now, Israel didn't leave this simply as an assertion. The problem with negotiations is they go up and down. You might have someday a president who's critical of Israel. There could be geopolitical changes that make this difficult to sustain. And so what Israel has done all these years is what we call creating facts on the ground. The idea is that we create facts on the ground that are so massive and so permanent that they make the occupation irreversible. That it doesn't matter what happens in negotiations. It doesn't matter what external pressures are put on Israel. The reality on the ground is one in which there can never be a Palestinian state, at least a viable state, and you'll never get Israel out of Judea, Samaria, and Jerusalem. Now, without going too much into detail, Israel has actually done this in a clever way. It uses techniques of planning, zoning, building of infrastructure, the demolishing of homes, the building of settlements, all kinds of mechanisms that are very undramatic, gray, dull, boring. That's why I'm not going to get into it too much. Mechanisms that almost seem neutral. Building a highway. I mean, what's bad about building a highway? That's part of development, right? Highways are good things. Well, but highways that are built in a way that serve one population, exclude another population, fragment the land, can become tools of control. And in fact, Israel has laid over the occupied territories what I call a matrix of control that makes its control permanent and irreversible. And there's a few elements. I just want to mention them quickly. I mean, some of you know this, but just to be sure that we're on the same page, there's a couple elements of the matrix of control. One is the fragmentation of Palestinian territory. So the Palestinians have all been confined to what we call areas A and B of the West Bank. Now, the occupied territories, again, are only 22% of historic Palestine. We have to remember that. So that Area A, which is the darker brown areas around the major cities, Area A is where the Palestinian Authority, on paper, theoretically, has complete authority. The idea is that this is Palestinian territory and Israel should not enter even. Although, as we all know, Israel invades or arrests people at will. There is no Area A in reality, but this is the idea of the Palestinian Authority. And the fact that there is a Palestinian Authority with a little territory is what gives the international community the ability to say the two-state solution is still a viable option. Because as long as there's a fictitious other side, a fictitious Palestinian government that controls a fictitious territory, you can keep saying, well, negotiations are possible and the two-state solution is still alive. So that Area A around the larger cities is 18% of the occupied territories. Area B, that are the lighter areas, you see these, it's hard to see on this map, the colors aren't so good. Well, the map's okay, the projector's not so good, but never mind. Area B is under Palestinian civil control. Municipalities, schools, and so on, but it's under Israeli security control, which means Israel controls. So, and that's another 22%. And then Gaza, which is a cage, basically. So that after 20 years of negotiations began in 1991 in Madrid. And then they went into Oslo. We don't even remember all the different processes. There was the Geneva Accords, there was the Annapolis process, then there was the roadmap with the quartet. I mean, Luxembourg is a part of the quartet. All these things. But after 20 years, after all these years of negotiations, all the Palestinians have gotten from Israel is 40%. The 18 of Area A, the 22 of Area B, 40% of 22% of their historic country. And that 40% is fragmented into about 70 islands. So some of them larger and some of them tiny. 70 islands, all controlled by Israel, because all around Area A and B, in all this gray area, plus the pink areas I'll talk about, this 60% of the occupied territories is what we call Area C. I mean, imagine living in this reality of moving from area to area. Area C is a 60% under full Israeli control. The Palestinian Authority is not allowed to be in Area C. And this is where the settlements are, which are all these blue dots all over the map. About 200 settlements. There's more than 500,000 Israelis living in the occupied territories. And they completely surround areas A and B. The settlements completely surrounded. So there's no coherent territory for Palestinians, and they have to continue to move over about 600 checkpoints in the territories dividing Palestinians from. So to get from one island to another can take hours. And it can be very dangerous because you're passing through soldiers, and if you don't behave exactly in the right way, and if you don't respond immediately to orders in Hebrew, because the soldiers don't know Arabic, you can be shot, which happens all the time. So that it's not only a hassle, but it's dangerous moving from one island to another. And just to show you a little bit about the, how ridiculous this all is, you have Salam Fayyad, who's the Palestinian, kind of the prime minister. He was never elected, but he's been a sort of appointed prime minister who comes from the World Bank and is a great believer in neoliberalism. He's the George Bush of the Palestinians. And he's been given billions by Europe and by the World Bank and by the United States to help develop Palestine. In other words, how do you develop 70 little islands that are completely disconnected from anything? There's no border with an Arab country. There's no coherent territory. You have no water because Israel controls all the water of the West Bank in Area C. You have no tourism because Israel controls Jerusalem, which is the heart of tourism. What do you develop? But Fayyad, with his money, has built a new city. There's a city, this is Ramallah. Ramallah, looks like Luxembourg. Beautiful buildings, sushi restaurants on every corner, because there's billions and billions of dollars that go into the NGOs that the Palestinians hate, but in the name of development. They're trying to buy off the Palestinians, basically. So there's a huge middle class that's developed. A lot of rich people. It's very neoliberal. So that Fayyad has built a new city right about in here. Well, if this is Ramallah, it's actually right about in here on one of these little dots, because he'll only build in area A or B. He can't build Fayyad, even with the World Bank behind him, in area C. So here's Ramallah, and here is the new city that he built. Okay. It's a new city. But you can't get to it because the road from Ramallah to this new city goes through area C. And Israel won't allow the Palestinians to build a road in area C, even with all this international support. So this whole city is there, and it's pretty inaccessible to people. So it just shows you the futility of trying to develop under occupation. You can't, it's ridiculous. So that you have area C, and then these pink areas, just in a word, these pink areas are what Israel calls its settlement blocks. You have to understand there's a difference between settlements and settlement blocks. All these little settlements here, Israel could give up. They're just a few people. But what Israel wants to keep are 7 settlement blocks of big settlements that give it control of the occupied territories. Ariel, that controls the Jordan River and the border with Jordan. Not Ariel, the Jordan Valley here, these settlements. In 1967, there were about 250,000 Palestinians that lived in the Jordan Valley. Here's Jericho. It's a very rich agricultural area. Today, there are less than 50,000 left. Israel has expelled almost all the Palestinians out of the Jordan Valley, and those that are left get no water whatsoever. And they've been replaced by Israeli settlements and farms and agriculture. That's why in BDS, We call for the boycott, especially of agricultural produce coming from the Jordan Valley, but in general. Then you have what's called the Ariel block that divides the West Bank east and west around the city of Ariel in the center. And here Israel just inaugurated its first university. There's a full Israeli university now in Ariel. So the next time in BDS, and if somebody talks about academic boycott, and people say academic freedom, you can't boycott universities, remind them that universities in Israel are a part of the occupation. They're in the occupied territories, and even universities like Tel Aviv University they have all kinds of programs they're very proud of, training Israeli soldiers, developing weapons with the Israeli army. The Israeli universities are military and occupation centers as much as they are academic institutions. And the academic boycott, of course, is against institutions that are a part of occupation and militarism. So Ariel has a university, but it controls, again, it divides the West Bank, so you begin to see now what Israel calls a Palestinian canton emerging in the north here. You see? Then there's another settlement block called Modi'in that connects to Jerusalem around the city of Modi'in that straddles the Green Line. It's on both sides of the Green Line. Here in the West Bank, this is called Upper Modi'in, and it's being built as the largest city in Israel. It will be larger than Tel Aviv. And the idea is then to link up the settlements up here to Jerusalem and link the whole West Bank to Tel Aviv. A whole urban area is being developed between actually Ma'ale Adumim to the east of Jerusalem, what we call the Jerusalem corridor, Ma'ale Adumim, and all the way up to Tel Aviv. And then, of course, up north. This is a new highway going up north. So it's the way physically you incorporate the West Bank into Israel so it becomes one piece. The whole country is reconfigured because, I don't want to get too much into this, but the two-state solution is based on a north-south axis. Here is Israel, and alongside of it is a Palestinian state. So the whole idea of the matrix of control is to create east-west routes, highways and settlements and so on that break the idea that there's a coherent piece of Palestine here that can be detached from Israel. So you have the Modi'in block. Then you have three blocks that make up what we call Greater Jerusalem. Because Jerusalem has become a region that controls the whole center of the West Bank. So there's what's called Givat Ze'ev, which is a city around here, and to the east, Ma'ale Adumim, which is a city that goes all the way to Jericho. And it cuts the West Bank in half. And then the Etzion block to the southwest. So all this becomes Greater Jerusalem. The World Bank estimates that 40% of the Palestinian economy revolves around Jerusalem, because this is where tourism is in particular. So by cutting out Jerusalem from any Palestinian state or society, Israel cuts the economic heart out of a Palestinian state. So the Palestinians at some point might get some land, but it's sterile land without any developmental potential, no economy, no water. And finally, there's a settlement block coming from the south up here to Hebron as well. This might go at some point. Hebron is like Gaza, but right now it's here. So this then creates three cantons, a canton in the north, a canton for Palestinians in the center, a canton in the south, and then Gaza. And so the idea is The idea is that those cantons, if there will be a Palestinian state, and that's certainly not clear, that it's already fragmented and cantonized. Okay. Now, let's go for a minute to the occupation on the ground. You know, the Palestinians, Palestine is an agricultural society. So the land that Palestinians own falls in Area C. Some of it's been taken for settlements. By the way, another element of the matrix are these highways. Israeli-only highways, 29 major highways that then link the settlements into Israel. So again, it's a part of incorporating the West Bank into Israel. And I have to say that the highways are apartheid highways. Either there are highways that are exclusively for Israelis, or there are highways that are being built now with walls down the center. So on one side of the road is Israeli traffic, and on the other side of the same road, Palestinian traffic. So that all of this then fragments and controls Palestinian territory with the settlements and so on. But Palestinians own land in Area C, so that the policy of house demolitions is to force Palestinians into areas A and B, or to get them out of the country completely. It's been estimated that 300,000 or so Palestinians have left the occupied territories in the last 10 or 12 years. So, and the people that leave are the middle class. In other words, the middle class, if Israel can get the middle class out, the common people are much easier to control. And then you push them into A and B. So today, 95% of the Palestinians in the West Bank live in areas A and B. And they've been all pushed out of Area C. So house demolitions is a key policy towards keeping Area C free, so that it can be annexed. Okay, so let's just see how this works for a couple minutes. This is the Shawamri family. They live in the town of Anata. I was going to say village because even I get into it. Language is very important. Everywhere where Arabs live is a village. I don't care if it's 50,000 people. Arabs live in villages, and Israeli Jews live in cities and towns and neighborhoods. So that an Israeli would say, like I caught myself, but saying they live in the village of Anata. But in fact, it's a town. And Salim Shawamre, his wife Arabia, and their 7 kids. Salim is an engineer, a construction engineer, and went to live in Saudi Arabia, married Arabia, who's his cousin. Both of them are children of refugees from 1948, from inside Israel. They married and went to Saudi Arabia, where Salim worked for about 10 years as an engineer. Made a little bit of money. And when the Oslo peace process began in the early 1990s, they came back to Palestine, like thousands of other Palestinians, to build a home and be a part of building Palestine. The occupation hadn't ended, but there were all these hopes in Oslo. Some of us remember that. So their house is in Area C. They owned the land. They bought land near the Shuafat refugee camp in Jerusalem, where Salim grew up. So this is very close to Jerusalem, but in the West Bank. And Salim had to apply to the Israeli military government for a building permit. The military government we call the civil administration, in order to lower the idea that there's an occupation or it's military. It's just proper administration. But the civil administration, like the Israeli government, has a policy of not granting building permits to Palestinians. Since 1967, Israel has frozen Palestinian building. not only in the West Bank, also in East Jerusalem, where houses are demolished by the municipality or the Ministry of Interior. And I want to emphasize this, inside Israel as well. Don't think the situation of Palestinians inside Israel is much better than the Palestinians in the occupied territories. The Palestinians are about 20% of the Israeli population, but they're confined by law and planning to 3.5% of the land. 94% of the land of the state of Israel is off limits to non-Jews. Even Israeli citizens who are not Jews cannot live on 94% of the land of the state of Israel. So it's the same system. As a matter of fact, last year, the Israeli government demolished 3 times more houses of Israeli citizens than it did of Palestinians living in the West Bank. And those Israeli citizens, of course, were all Arab, either Palestinians or Bedouins. There's one famous community of Bedouins in the Negev, some of you have been there, that's been demolished more than 30 times, the entire community of Bedouins. So that Salim and Arabia applied to the civil administration for a permit, and of course they were refused. And it's very clever. Look, Israel calls itself the only democracy in the Middle East, right? Well, how can you justify then demolishing Palestinian homes, discriminating and not allowing one population to have housing? Well, it's simple. Israel has zoned the entire West Bank as agricultural land. So when a Palestinian like Salim applies for a permit, the answer is, we'd love to give you a building permit, but this is agricultural land. Sorry. Now, it doesn't matter. We'll see in a minute that this is mainly desert. I mean, there are fertile parts of the West Bank, but here in Anata, this is the Judean desert. It doesn't matter because it's just a pretext for a mechanism for denying a building permit. But they play mind games with Palestinians. Good cop, bad cop. So they said to Salim, now, every time you apply for a permit, it costs you $5,000. So Salim had some money because he had worked in Saudi Arabia. So they said to him, you know what, you're a good guy. We like the color of your eyes or something. Apply a second time. I think we'll give you a permit if you apply again. Okay, another $5,000. They apply again. Another year goes by, and the answer comes back, sorry, we can't do it because the slope of your land is too steep. So Salim says, we live in the Judean mountains, and every mountain should have a slope. I mean, settlements are built on slopes. No, but that was the reason for not giving him a permit. Now, you can also ask, wait a minute, if Palestinians can't get permits because this is all agricultural, what about these 200 settlements? They're on the same agricultural land. Well, again, we sit on the planning commissions. So to rezone from agriculture to residential takes a minute if you want to do it. So you can always rezone for a settlement where, because Salim actually lives here. This is Anata, and right next door is Mali Adumim. It's the same land. But this has been zoned as agricultural land, and this has been rezoned for residential. So you rezone for land that Israel wants to build settlements on. So it's a real manipulation of planning. But they said, you know what? You've always been a good guy. You've never been political. You've never been a terrorist. You've made no problems. You know what? Apply a third time. We're sure we'll give you the permit. Okay, another $5,000, another year, and the answer came back, sorry, but on the deed to your land of ownership, you're missing 2 signatures. So we can't verify that this land actually belongs to you. So we were already involved with Salim in this. So we all said, okay, now we're getting somewhere. Tell us what 2 signatures are missing. I mean, if you know there's 2 signatures, you got to know what 2 signatures, and we'll go sign them, and the deed will be legal, and you can give the building permit. Well, they said, we don't know what 2 signatures. Okay. So what we did is we went out and we signed everybody in Anata. This is a town of about 15,000 people. Everybody in Anata that owns land. We signed them saying, we have no problem with the Shawamri family building on their land. It's fine. And we took this whole paper, all stamped by lawyers, to the civil administration. We put it on their desk and we said, here, take whatever 2 signatures you need. All the signatures are here. Take it and let's get ahead. And their answer was, we lost the file. We have no idea. And the money's gone. The money is gone. So the Shawamri family had to do what thousands of Palestinian families have to do, and that's build a home without a building permit. There are tens of thousands of demolition orders against Palestinian houses in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. East Jerusalem alone is not a very big area. There are 22,000 demolition orders on houses only in East Jerusalem. We don't know exactly how many in the West Bank. So Salim then simply had to build a modest home for his family. Immediately, he got a demolition order from the civil administration. Okay, now, this is like a lottery. You know, it isn't well, it's like a lottery, and that is that Israel has thousands of homes to demolish. So you say, okay, I'll build. Maybe they won't come for a year. I mean, they can't demolish all these houses. Maybe I'll live in the house for 5 years. Maybe in 5 years there'll be peace. The situation will change. Maybe they'll forget about me and they'll never come. You know, it's like a gamble. It's like a lottery kind of a thing. And in fact, the family lived in their home for 5 years, not at peace. Because, you know, you're not living secure. I've talked to many Palestinian women who say to me, the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning is I look out the window to see if there's the army, bulldozers, and if everything is quiet, I get dressed and wake up the kids and start making breakfast. So you're not living in your home securely, but you're in your home for 5 years. One day, in July 1998, the family was having lunch, and there was a knock on the door. Now, I don't know what civil servants look like in Luxembourg, but this is what civil servants look like if you're a Palestinian. This is Rami, and this is Micha. These are 2 officials of the civil administration. You see, they're dressed in civil clothes. They're not exactly civil, but they give that appearance then of that there isn't occupation, that this is proper civilian administration. Now, of course, they come accompanied by soldiers, some of whom think this is a big joke. And you know, the civil administration is located in the middle of the West Bank. So what Israeli civilians can go work for it? You're not going to drive from Tel Aviv or from Jerusalem to the West Bank. Settlers. So here you have settlers who are ideologically committed to getting Palestinians out of the land of Israel, put in positions of power to decide what Palestinian can stay in his home and what Palestinian is going to be demolished. Salim answers the door. Rami says to Salim, "Is this your house?" Salim says, "Yes, it's my house." He says, "No, it isn't. It's our house now. You got 15 minutes to get all your belongings out. We're going to demolish it." Now, this happened to happen in the middle of the day, which is unusual. It's usually early in the morning. They had already demolished 4 houses. Now, they thought they could get one more in before the end of the day. So, what would you say? You know, you're not a terrorist, and this is what's important. This has nothing to do with security. There's no terrorism, there's no criminal activity. Salim was never accused of anything. You know, house demolitions simply happen to average, normal people. It has nothing to do with, and I say that because Israel is always framing its policies in terms of security. Everything we do is for security. Here, why is Israel demolishing this family's home? It's not security. So that Salim, of course, like every one of us, protested. What? No, and you can't demolish my house. And the minute that happens, the army kicks in literally. The army's not there for decoration. And Salim was beaten and thrown out of his house. Okay? Now, in all the commotion that happens, Arabia, his wife, managed to close the door with her and her children inside, her small children inside. So the soldiers broke the windows and threw tear gas inside the house. Now, I don't know in peaceful Luxembourg if you've ever had a smell of tear gas, but it's very powerful outside. And in fact, it's written on the canister, for outdoor use only. It's forbidden to have tear gas inside a building in a normal world. So that it was thrown in, and then the soldiers broke in the door. Arabia was carried out unconscious. The children running and screaming in all directions. Now, this is a trauma that's going to stay with this family forever. It isn't that a house is demolished and it's too bad, and then the next day you get on with your life. This is a trauma that these kids are going to live forever. And multiply this 28,000 times. So, the family's out of the house. Now we get into the act. As Israeli activists, if we can get there in time, which often doesn't happen, but if we can, we go and or sometimes we have an idea, because you never know when they're going to demolish or what house. And there's thousands of demolition orders. Sometimes we get a sense of a house that we think is vulnerable, and we might sleep in the house for a week. But we don't know. But if we get a call from the family, or sometimes we get a call at 5 o'clock in the morning from a Palestinian who says, the trucks carrying the bulldozers just went by my house. So we get an idea where they're going. We go out, we chain ourselves in houses, we get in front of bulldozers, which is why I'm built this way. We get on top of the roof. We do anything we can to delay the occupation. Some of our activists are calling the consuls. Some of our activists are calling journalists. And we try to make a commotion, because the more attention we can call to this, then the soldiers might have come to demolish 10 houses. But if there's a lot of attention, they'll withdraw after one. We can't save this house. The house that we can't save it. It's gone. But maybe they'll withdraw and we can save the next house or two. And finally, the family's out of the house. We're out of the house. And the civil administration subcontracts to commercial wrecking companies. In other words, if you have a company that you own a bulldozer, you can get a contract to demolish Palestinian homes. It's a commercial thing. It isn't the army that demolishes. The army subcontracts. So here the contractor then sends in workers to throw out all the furniture of the house. This is a worker from Romania, actually, one of the foreign workers. You see, and everything is thrown out. Imagine everything. Your home is your most intimate, really sacred space. Imagine what you own in your home all being torn out, thrown out. It's all ruined. Your papers flying all over, your kids' toys all over. You can imagine. This happened to be in July. You can imagine if it's in winter when everything really gets ruined. But here also it's ruined. And then the bulldozer comes to demolish the home. And the bulldozer comes through the wall that Salim built. And this is actually desert. So Salim brought truckloads of dirt so he could create a garden around his house, and he planted 52 different kinds of trees. Lemon trees and olive trees and nut trees and apple trees. So it comes through his garden to demolish the house. Now here there's a kind of a tragedy in a tragedy. The driver of the bulldozer is a Palestinian. He's just a guy that works for this company. You see, and he comes one morning and the boss says, you're going to go build a road. The next morning he comes and the boss says, I have a contract to demolish homes. You're going to go demolish Palestinian homes. And he knew Salim. He was a friend of Salim's. So you can imagine what's going on in his head as he's sent to demolish the home of his friend. Here's Micha, the civil administration official, you see, with a camera. Everything is photographed. So if Salim decides to go to court, everything is documented, that everything is legal and done according to the law. And Salim is lying on the ground, not a criminal, not a terrorist, an average, simple person watching his home be demolished. And it was completely demolished. So, what we do as Israeli activists is we rebuild homes that have been demolished. In fact, tonight, after the talk, you're going to be asked to maybe contribute something to ICAD, to our work, because this is how we're not getting money from the Rockefeller Foundation or the European Union to rebuild Palestinian homes. It's only from people. But we get the money and we go out and rebuild homes together with Palestinians. In the light of day, this is resistance work. These are political acts of resistance. It's not humanitarian. We don't ask the Israeli authorities for a permit. We don't coordinate with the army. We do this in the light of day. It takes us about 2 weeks to build a home, and you're all invited to come, especially in the summers. We have rebuilding camps, but we build all year. We've built 186 homes over the last 15 years. Now, if that was humanitarian, it would mean nothing. What's 186 out of 28,000? But if you think of these as 186 acts of joint resistance by Israelis and Palestinians, that's a very meaningful thing. So we built the house. You see Israelis come out. Here, for example, is a shirt of Gush Shalom, which is Ori Avneri's group. You also have internationals that come. You see these guys with the red hats. They're from what's called the Christian peacemaker teams that come to work with us. So Israelis, Palestinians. You can begin to see here how agricultural the land is around. And we build a home. We work only with Palestinian organizations. We're very careful as Israelis not to presume that we can do anything we want in the occupied territories. We work especially with the Land Defense Committee. Again, you can see how agricultural the land is. Here's Arabia, between two Israeli women rebuilding her home. So it's not only solidarity, but it really is a very important means of support for Palestinian families that are financially ruined, that are scared, intimidated. And here you can actually do something literally concrete to rebuild your home. But the home can also be demolished again. I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but Salim and Arabia's home was demolished 6 times. We rebuilt it each time, and it was as a political act of resistance, and it was demolished and rebuilt and demolished 6 times. This is one of the demolitions with a Caterpillar bulldozer. Just one kind of interesting little curiosity here. This is the Hebrew University. That's how close Anata is to Jerusalem. And in fact, this building is the Truman Peace Center at the Hebrew University. So you can sit in the library of the Truman Peace Center and watch a home being demolished down the road. Now, Israelis in this university, in the Hebrew University, have no idea what's going on. If they happen to look out the window, they don't know if a road is being built, or if anything is happening. They don't know that this is a house demolition. They don't even know that the name of this place is called Anata. For Israelis looking out the window, this is somewhere where Arabs live. It has no name. There's no connection. It's just background, sort of. And the house was demolished 6 times. One of the times we rebuilt it with a mural on the wall. This is the artist, and it was done with, this is a dead Caterpillar bulldozer on a pile of dead armaments. What's interesting is you see here, these are workers, Jewish workers, Palestinian workers, international workers, the idea being that there's solidarity, at least workers' solidarity here. And the mural is under the figures of 2 women that died in house demolitions. One was Rachel Corrie. I would assume some of you know her name. She was a young American student who was crushed by an Israeli bulldozer in Gaza in 2003 when she was trying to defend with a bright orange vest a Palestinian home that was going to be demolished. She was run over twice by the bulldozer. And this is Nuhas Sweidan. She was a Palestinian woman in Gaza who was killed about 2 weeks before Rachel at night in bed. She was the pregnant mother of 10 children who was killed in her bed at night when the Israeli authorities demolished her house on top of the family. So the house was dedicated to these 2 women. And just in November, so we're talking about 3 months ago or so, 3-4 months ago, in the middle of the night, because now the Israeli army is doing something different. They used to come at 5 or 5:30 in the morning. They would wait for the men to leave for work, where it's only women and children in the homes, and then they would come down and isolate the homes and demolish them. In the last couple of years, they started to come in the middle of the night. So this is a cold November night. This is about 2 o'clock in the morning. It's raining. These are the mountains. Jerusalem isn't such a warm place. It's in the mountains, raining, and the soldiers come. And this night they demolished Beit Arabia for the 6th time. The same night they demolished 8 Bedouin homes. And the home of another family that we had rebuilt for the year before, a family of 17 children. So 17 children and everybody were driven out of the house at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the home was demolished. The bulldozers come, and here's Salim in the ruins of his home. This is just 3 months ago. Okay. And again, sitting in the ruins of her home. Okay. Let me just finish with one more element of the matrix in a couple minutes, and then we'll stop. And that's the wall. So Israel has built what we call an apartheid wall. Israel calls it the separation barrier. Israel uses the word apartheid, or separation. It's not the security barrier. It's a separation barrier that again, it outlines the cantons of the Palestinians in concrete. It locks them into these islands, and then it incorporates these large settlement blocks that we talked about, you see? And it goes like this, and it goes around Jerusalem and so on. The wall, for those of you that haven't seen it, is more than twice as high as the Berlin Wall was. The Berlin Wall was 4 meters high. This is more than 8 meters high, this wall. And it's not built between Israelis and Palestinians. And if this was for security, you would think that it would divide Israelis on one side and Palestinians on the other side. No. The wall is built in the middle of Palestinian communities because Israelis don't want to see the wall. Israelis don't want to wall themselves in. And therefore, the wall is built. Here's the wall going through Bethlehem. Here's a Palestinian grandmother in Bethlehem. Her grandchildren live in Beit Jala, right here. And the wall comes through their community, separating the community. You see? And so it's clear it's not a security barrier. If it's against Palestinians, then we have Palestinians on both sides of the wall. So where's the security with that? And the wall is 5 times longer than the Berlin Wall was. And the wall, as we saw, is not linear like the Berlin Wall was. That cut Germany like this, but it encloses, it imprisons tens of thousands of Palestinians within cells. This, for example, is the city of Tulkarm. About 70,000 people completely surrounded by the wall, literally imprisoned. And the wall, as you can see, goes through Palestinian neighborhoods. This is Abu Dis, with the wall going right down the center of the city. No Israelis in kilometers of this place. So finally, this is the two-state solution that we started with. Israel's idea of the two-state solution is not 22%, but 15% of historic Palestine would be a Palestinian state. In other words, we can see now the map. You don't have to be a genius to figure this out. You take areas A and B, you take out the settlement blocks, you add the route of the wall, you take out Jerusalem, and this is what you get. And this is what we call apartheid. This is a Bantustan. It is not a viable Palestinian state. But what's interesting is apartheid is the liberal approach in Israel. Everybody gets upset when you say apartheid. That's actually understating the case. The apartheid plan of this was the Labor Party plan. This is Ehud Barak. And this is Shimon Peres, our Nobel Peace Prize winner. And this is the Labor Party's plan of a two-state solution in which the Palestinians are reduced to living in a non-viable Bantustan. Netanyahu says, wait a minute, why should we give 15% of our land to Arabs. That's why. No, we're not going to give anything. So I would say that there's a situation worse than apartheid. And that is what we call in English, sorry you guys, warehousing. It's like being in a warehouse. Or, you know what, let's just say imprisonment. Permanent imprisonment of a whole population. Because Israel says, no, we're not going to give them any state. We're going to lock them into areas A and B, and that's it. That's it. There's no more political process. There's no more negotiations. We're not going anywhere. The international community can feed the Palestinians. If they want to give Fayyad some money to build cities, go ahead. But there is no more political process. We are going to go into a situation of warehousing forever. And in fact, I've had meetings in your foreign ministry today, in the foreign ministry in Norway last week. I was in Belgium last week. And this is the message that we're getting from the governments. The governments say, we are committed to the two-state solution, period. That's it. There has to be a two-state solution. So we say to them, well, what if the two-state solution doesn't happen? What if it's either apartheid, or what if the Palestinian Authority collapses, which is going to happen, or Abu Mazen resigns, and then there is no more pretense of negotiations or two states? Then what? What if the two-state solution is gone? And finally, we say it's gone, but finally you, the governments, understand that it's gone. Would you go to another solution? Maybe a one-state solution? A binational solution? No. No. We will only entertain the two-state solution, period. And if the Palestinian Authority falls apart, we will increase our humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, but we are not going to go for a one-state solution. So the governments are essentially committed at best to apartheid. I mean, certainly we're not going to get to this. So governments are committed at best to apartheid, and at worst to warehousing. And they will not go to another solution. That's where we have to push them. And we haven't really formulated a one-state proposal yet. The Palestinians themselves are caught. And I'll tell you why, and I'll end on this. The Palestinians know, I mean, everybody that's been there knows, that the two-state solution is finished. That there is no more two-state solution. But the two-state solution is the Palestinians' only chance to have, this is a movement of national liberation. Their only chance to have self-determination, at least in a little tiny state. That's the only chance they have of being in the UN, of having a flag, of going to the Olympics. And so they don't want to give it up. So I think emotionally, no, let me put it this way. Intellectually, politically, they know that it's gone. But emotionally and conceptually, they're hanging on to it. And they're resisting going to a one-state solution, because a one-state solution means that they're locked forever into a state with their oppressors, with the Israelis. And that doesn't give them, there's no Palestinian state, there's no national expression. And so they're really kind of stuck. I think the Palestinians themselves don't know where to go exactly. Certainly the left that we work with. So we're kind of in between solutions today, but governments are not helping. And the way, of course, that Israel is winning. Israel thinks it's won already, because neither Europe nor the United States, certainly, the international community will not sanction Israel. They'll criticize Israel, but that's it. There are no sanctions. And so Israel says, we don't care if you criticize us. The process I'm laying out for you of warehousing, of imprisonment, is going on and will continue to go on. And we're going to have a prison in the Holy Land on the southern border of Europe that's made possible by Europe. And this is a Europe committed to human rights and international law. And so, in a sense, this is really a challenge to Europe, as well as to Luxembourg itself and to the international community. Can we really allow this? And if this, in fact, happens, as is happening, can we look in the mirror and use the word human rights anymore? Or does it become a joke? So I'll leave it at that, and we'll have time for discussion.